Well, thank you for including me in your meeting. I've been doing this so long, I've seen a real transformation where we used to speak for patients, then we kind of spoke to patients, and now hopefully we do better listening. I will also commend you on your 50th anniversary. I'm old enough that I can't really remember what I was doing when I was 50, but hopefully it was something positive. So these are simple disclosures, relationships I have with various companies. None of them affect this talk. I think that we need to kind of understand the framework for how we got to where we are today. So prior to 1968, concepts around brain death and organ donation were very hazy. They weren't codified, and so the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act was the first attempt at establishing a national transplant program. NOTA, or the National Organ Transplant Act, which we'll talk about in a moment, was enacted in 1984, and then we'll talk about the final rule, which is really now driving discussions about allocation. So who are the players? If you want to know who to talk to, who influences policy, who creates it, these are the groups that are most important. So transplantation falls under the Department of Health and Human Services, and within that, the division charged with direct oversight of transplant is Health Resources Services Administration, or HRSA. So HRSA oversees this, but they don't directly manage it. They issued a contract to UNOS, who actually oversees the operation of the organ procurement and transplant network. So UNOS is a group that's open to bids. I forget, somebody here could tell me when the last time it was open for bid. I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, but the only group to ever hold this contract has been UNOS. So the National Organ Transplant Act was sponsored by Al Gore and Orrin Hatch. Prior to this, it was a bit the Wild West. There were people who were advertising in magazines that if you had kidney failure and you paid them a certain amount of money and you paid the broker a commission, they could get you a kidney. Not a very transparent nor fair system. I'm old enough to remember when we started the hospital I trained at, you'd go around to the adjacent hospitals and work out an agreement with them. If there was somebody who was thought to be brain dead and the family wanted to donate, they would just basically say, okay, here, go ahead, retrieve the organs and use them however you see best fit. Then that seemed unfair, so they created a waiting list, but they still had a system where the hospital got to keep one kidney and put it in whoever they thought was best. So obviously you can see how this goes wrong. So they said you can't sell organs. It mandated the establishment of an expert panel or a task force to provide advice about how to set this up. It authorized them to set up these organ procurement organizations and the OPTN, and importantly, it created the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. So long before other areas of medicine began to collect, analyze, and report their results, the transplant community did that. And Richard actually serves as an advisor on a panel to that group. So I think that's a group of great importance. So this is the current way organ allocation and distribution is set up. So the country's broken into 11 regions. I'm from Atlanta, so I'm in Region 3. You can see where you are. What you can't see in the other thing is there are these donation service areas or donor service areas. There are 58 of them, and they control policy at the local level, allocation. And the problem is there are 58 of them, and there are about 60, apologies to those of you who work for them, but there are about 60 different policies. The rules for how organs are procured, how they're shipped, it's highly variable. And so that's one thing that would help to standardize to make this more efficient. So now we come to the final rule. In 1998, Donna Shalala issued the original final rule, which was designed to distribute organs more equitably. We'll come to this, but there's a large disparities in who gets transplanted, and a lot of that has to do with geography. The implementation was delayed until 2000, in part because a number of states and universities sued the government, claiming that organs belonged to states or regions, and as it turns out, states can't sue the federal government. That was a fairly short suit. So what does the final rule intend? First of all, it says that you must use sound judgment in allocating kidneys. It says that you have to achieve the optimal use of the organs. You have to preserve the ability of the transplant center to decide whether or not to accept an offer. And Richard touched on this just a little bit. It's appropriate. There are organs that should not be transplanted. They might be appropriate for one recipient and not another. That's an important part of the medical decision making, but it's not very transparent while you're on the waiting list what's happening. And I think that's one thing that the field could really do to improve so that you're more a partner in deciding what you would be comfortable with. You're supposed to avoid wasting organs. You wouldn't want to procure an organ and not be able to expeditiously place it, so it just, the timeline on it expires. You don't want to perform futile transplants. Certainly no one in this room wants to receive a transplant that doesn't help them, especially if it could help somebody else. You want to promote access to transplant. That's something we have not done exceptionally well. And finally, you want to efficiently, and this will be important when we talk about the new allocation proposal out for comment, you want to make this efficient. You don't want to be, flying kidneys all over if you can just use it equally well in somebody equally deserving locally. And so this brings us to geographic disparities, and this is driving everything now, and there are more lawsuits, and so we'll see how this goes. But it says that your place of residence should not determine your access to a transplant. It also says things like you cannot propose a policy or enact a policy that decreases the total number of transplants performed. And you can imagine that in some cases, these aren't really aligned. Perhaps to me, if the very best recipient for a kidney procured in Honolulu is in Maine, that just may not be practical. And so these are not all always lined up, and I think that's where the debate comes in. So this is a talk that I gave with Alex Weissman to our fellows at a transplant meeting in Dallas in 2013. So at 2013, when we gave this talk, you basically got to the top of the list based on points. You got 1 point for every year you'd been active on the waiting list. You got 1 point for matching certain antigens, compatibility antigens. You got points if you were highly sensitized, meaning you had a lot of antibodies that prevented you from being compatible with most recipients. So, if you were only compatible with 1 in 10 recipients, you're disadvantaged compared to somebody who's compatible with 9 of 10. So I thought you should give points there. And then you got points if you were a former living kidney donor. We should honor those and reward those who have made an impressive sacrifice. Practically speaking, this unbalanced the system, though, because what it became is just the person who waited the longest got the kidney, whether they were the best for the kidney or not. And so there was that, and some of the HLA, those histocompatibility matching, I said, disadvantaged certain ethnic groups. So they decided to rectify this. So this is driven by what they called, the original proposal was called life years following transplant. And this shows you that if you look at the panel to the right, this bottom line here shows what your life expectancy on dialysis is, and this is transplant, and everything in between is life years gained. And it shows you for a 20 and a 50-year-old. Well, you can quickly look at that and tell that overall 20-year-olds benefit more from transplant because they have more life ahead of them. That's not surprising. So they came up with the idea where there was a mathematical formula to predict how long a kidney was likely to survive, and there was a mathematical formula to predict how many life years people would gain following the transplant. And they said, why don't we take the kidney that will last the longest and put it in the person who will live the longest? Kind of makes sense on some level. They also said there's a real injustice. If I sit on dialysis for 5 years before my nephrologist refers me, and then I go and I get listed, that's times 0. So if it takes me 5 years to get a transplant, I'll wait 10 years before I'm transplanted. Somebody else has a nephrologist who sends them before they're on dialysis. They wait 5 years, not fair. So they said, we're going to give you waiting time from when you first start dialysis or develop stage 5 CKD. So they were going to fix all those things. And this didn't fly at all. Said this is age discrimination, because you can see here, what happens is you just shifted all the kidneys to younger people because you were predicted to add more years of life to the pool. And as somebody who's in their 60s, I suppose on some level, again, I accept that, but I don't want to be totally disadvantaged. They came up with several proposals. The first was national sharing. No matter where the kidney comes from, it goes to the best person in the country to maximize life years. Well, you would add 34,000 life years with that policy. But there's some discrimination there, there's some logistic problems. So they eventually came up with what they call longevity matching, and we'll come back to that. These are the factors that just go in case you're interested, into what predicts how long a kidney lasts. So these are donor factors, and then these are recipient factors. And one of those, if you'll be able to join me talking about preemptive transplant, one of the more important things is time on dialysis, a powerful predictor of survival following transplant. So what they ended up doing is they broke kidneys into the top 20% based on that formula, the bottom 15%, and kind of everything in between. And then that drives how it's allocated. So they did partially match longevity. So if it's the top 20% of kidneys, it goes to the top 20% of recipients. The other thing I'd point out is this bottom part here is what we call high KDPI kidneys. Those are the bottom 15% of kidneys that are transplanted, but are still transplanted. They still help people. For that, people signed a separate consent. And where that really makes sense is I age. You know, if somebody tells me I can wait 8 years and get a kidney that goes 20 years, but I'm 75 years old, that's not very helpful. I'd rather get a kidney, to Richard's point, that might go 3 or 4 or 5 years, but I can get it like soon because I need it now. And so that's kind of what this allocation system was designed. Even here, this is the survival of the worst kidneys versus the best. It's still pretty darn good. So, and this is to the point of one of our previous speakers, this is the discard rate. So you can see, or the number of kidneys no one chooses to transplant. So at this higher thing, a lot of these kidneys can help people, but they're thrown away because we're afraid perhaps of hurting individual people. But this is where a conversation with patients matters. We don't all make the same decision. I need to know what your preferences are if we're going to be able to meet your needs. This simply tells you, it's a complex slide, but it says waiting times are going up. Not shocking to any of you. This is, though, a slide that Alex made that we showed in 2013, and this is waiting time based on where you live in the country. So if you go back and look like here in kind of Kansas, the waiting time's really short, on average less than 19 months. Now this is data that's a little old, like about 2 decades old. But you can see already in California, the wait time can't be calculated. They don't transplant enough people to know how long the average patient waits. And people say, why is that fair? That seems unfair. Geography is determining your ability to be transplanted. Interestingly, again, I'm in Georgia. We have medium waiting time. Right next door is Mississippi, or is Alabama, that has one of the longest waiting times. We get a ton of people who cross the state line to get transplanted because we can transplant them faster. Why is that? Doesn't seem reasonable. Several groups here, and I won't read all this, but have said that donated organs are a national resource. It doesn't belong to the state of Georgia. It doesn't belong to the city of Atlanta. It doesn't belong to Emory University. It's a national resource. So that's a fundamental underpinning of policy. So the new kidney allocation system was created by the OPTN Kidney Transplant Committee. It's a group charged to this. It's out for public policy. So if you want to have your voice heard, you can simply log on, you can read the policy, and you can comment on whether you like it, what parts of it you'd like or don't like. The aim is to reduce geographic disparities by changing, not allocation. Kidneys will still be allocated roughly the same, but they're changing geographically. They're no longer, like where I live, there's an OPO called LifeLink of Georgia, and kidneys basically stay in Georgia. If you live in Chattanooga and there's a donor in the north part of Georgia, you're not really competitive for that kidney, not as much as somebody who lives in Atlanta, even further away. This just is some modeling done by UNOS that shows that the most powerful predictor of disparities in access to transplantation is what donor service area you're in. Now, you can make the argument that some donor service areas don't do as well recovering organs from willing deceased donors. That might be part of it, but part of it is just the ability or the frequency of donors. And this just shows the same thing here. These are all the DSAs, and it shows a huge variability in your likelihood of being transplanted. So what they said is they're going to, if there's a donor in this hospital, that's somewhere in Kansas, I believe, geography not being my strong suit, they draw a circle that's 500 nautical miles around it. And everybody in that circle has the chance to get that. Then it goes back to the same point system I told you about before. They also came up with a thing which they called proximity rating. So you can get between 1 and 4 points. So if you happen to be right in the same hospital as that donor, and that's where you're going to get your transplant done, you get 4 points. The further you go to the outside of the circle, the fewer points you get until you hit 0 on that 500-mile rim. If no one in that 500-mile rim or circle can use it, then you go outside another 2,500 miles. And there you get 8 points. So if you're at 501 miles, you get 8 points, and that goes down to 0 points if you're at 2,500 miles. But again, those points don't compete. It's in the circle mostly first. And this just shows that. They considered circles of other sizes, and that was the one that was thought to optimize transplants while still minimizing flying organs all over. In truth, if you have two people who are equivalent in terms of the benefit they would receive, and one's 50 miles away and one's 500 miles, you don't want planes flying organs all over. You don't want donor teams flying all over if you can avoid it. So I don't have time to go through this, but this is the allocation algorithm, and it's pretty much the same one that they enacted in 2014. So as in all things, there are people who gain and lose. So the group that gains is pediatric recipients, former living donors, I think I left off, African Americans, Latino ethnicity, women, people with longer waiting time, and more sensitized patients. Who loses? People over 50, and particularly those over 65, those living in rural areas, and those predicted to have the best survival following transplant, kind of paradoxical. That said, I'm pointing again to the wrong screen. These are all small changes. They're not big changes. So I'm going to be 65 in a couple of years. It's not that I'm not going to get a transplant. It goes down a little bit, not a lot. So for those of you approaching my age, don't worry. So these are the questions that specifically the Kidney Committee wants to hear. And I don't have time to read them all, but you can go online and pull this up. It's a very transparent process. But they want to say, should the circle be bigger? Should it be smaller? Should we give proximity points? They'll ask questions like that. And I'm going to finish with my thoughts. And I don't speak for anyone besides myself, and probably, in fact, no one agrees with me, but these are my ideas. So change is going to happen. The field has spent a lot of time trying to stop HRSA from enacting a change, and it's going to happen. They've interpreted the law saying there are geographic disparities and we need to correct those. I think that any proposal to me would be unacceptable if it decreases the number of transplants we do. And I think we need to have a proposal that maximizes the benefit that each kidney confers to people. I think other important things are that you make it, if you will, as inexpensive as you can. So you're not flying organs all over, you're not flying surgeons all over. Each year, surgeons are hurt and in some cases killed flying to do things, into small cities and airplanes. I think that's a silly thing, perhaps worse than silly. And then I'd say that the real problem for me with this is that we look at people who get on the list. I'm from Georgia. Georgia has some of the most disadvantaged people around. Most of our patients never get referred. They don't get evaluated. They don't get listed. There's data to show this very clearly. We don't speak for them because they don't count. If you don't get on the list, they're only looking at disparities of listed patients. So I think you should look at disparities based on the people who are eligible and who would benefit from a transplant. So that's my only knock against this policy. And so I'll stop there and apologize if I ran over. Thank you.
Thank you.